Don't hate.
Okay. Hello, my name is Tyrone Smith, and I will be conducting this interview for an ASU religious course. My interview seeks to explore the question, is racial reconciliation possible or even desired amongst Christians? Today, I will be interviewing Pastor Cory Powell. Pastor Powell is uniquely suited for this interview for his variety of engagement with diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. He is a prominent Black pastor in Lubbock, Texas, the pastor of New Dimensions Tabernacle. He has served as the first Black chairman of the Lubbock Chamber of Commerce. He founded and directed Mentor Tech, an organization that supported students of color to successfully matriculate through Texas Tech University. He now serves as senior director as the campus access and engagement. Hello, Pastor Powell. This interview is being recorded and will be used in an ASU undergraduate course. Do you understand and grant your permission for this interview to be recorded?
I do.
Thank you, sir. Well, before we get started, I just wanted to ask you to kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and what got you involved in this work.
Well, thank you, one, for reaching out and glad to assist. I graduated from the university here at Texas Tech and worked in the community for a number of years and worked with Big Brothers Big Sisters, worked with the Council on Alcohol and Drug Abuse. And then in 2000, accepted a full-time position at Texas Tech. And my initial office was the Office of Cultural Diversity, which was a system office. Texas Tech had the main campus as well as the Health Sciences Center, and the system was over all of that. We have since opened multiple branches in other locations, and even Midwestern State University is now part of our system. And so initially, I worked in our cultural diversity office. They changed the name of that to the Office of Community and Multicultural Affairs. They later changed the name of that to the Office of Community Relations. And then when I launched Mentor Tech, which was a mentoring program designed to provide students with academic support and adjustment to the university to aid in their retention and their matriculation back in 2002, that program became my full-time job. And so at some point around 2004, 2005, I was transitioned to the university's campus as part of the president's office and directed Mentor Tech for a number of years, 18 years or so, and then moved into, because they've changed names of things, and we became the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, before that was the Division Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement. And so I've literally spent my entire professional career at Texas Tech working in some form or fashion with diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Very good. How long have you been pastoring?
So our church launched in 2002, 2002, 2003. We launched our church.
Very good.
And so I've been the pastor of that church since that time.
Very good. So let's get into the meat of the matter.
Sure.
This course is called Religion, Culture, and Public Life. And in this course, we have studied the origin of religion around the world and the influences of colonization, white supremacy on religion, culture, and public life. I would argue that some of these elements still exist within our faith institutions, and they are rooted in white supremacy and colonization today, which keeps us divided. Recently, we saw a white pastor actually, Donnie Swaggart, use the Bible in an attempt to correct Black churches for supporting a particular political view or candidate, as if he had the right or traditional authority to do so. Also, in my observation, Black worshipers don't have an issue joining under a white senior pastor, but you find very few white believers willing to join under a Black senior pastor. Systematic racism plays a huge role in the sharing of power and authority in religious institutions. So having said that, my first question to you would be, how does systematic racism influence our churches?
Very good question, and I think uh, we have the systemic racism as a significant impact on churches and faith community in a variety of ways. I think one, it is the perpetuation of inequality. Um, when you look at systemic racism, it can manifest within church and church structures, perpetuating inequalities and marginalized people of color.
Mhm.
Um, it can also be seen in leadership positions, in the representation and the allocation of resources.
Mhm.
I have a friend who is a pastor who is an African American young man who was invited to be a part of a pastoral staff of a large, um, predominantly, well, it's an integrated church, but largely white church. The pastor is white, the whole setup is white. And, it's interesting the dialogue and conversation that he's had because they enjoy his style, they enjoy the appeal he has with the population of the congregants, but at the same time, there is a desire to kind of temper him
Mhm.
or try to get him to conform. Um, and there were some issues with staffing and things of that nature. And so the perpetuation of inequality, I think also it can stifle the dialogue that we have. Um, we don't have open and honest conversations about race and racism within churches. And in my opinion, this can result in a culture of silence. It can also involve a system of avoidance, like we just don't talk about it. And in my opinion and estimation, that prevents healing, understanding, and true progress. Because if we don't address those issues and those problems, because they exist,
Mhm.
whether we created them or we inherited them, they exist. And so our failure to really address the problem
Mhm.
to perpetuate it. Again, it also can limit the research. I'm sorry, the outreach that we have in terms of if racism within churches is prevalent and present, it can hinder our ability to serve diverse populations, diverse communities effectively. And so when that happens, if people of color do not feel welcome or included and valued in their faith communities,
Mhm.
they seek spiritual nourishment elsewhere. So going back to the pastor you mentioned at the very beginning in his conversation, I think one of the things that he fails to realize is that the whole existence of Black church is the result of racism
Right.
that prohibited the freedom of expressions of worship, right? And so that's the other part. If we try to push everyone into the same bottle, into the same box, then what we do is we create a desire for conformity versus appreciation for uniqueness. And so thereby you divide the body of Christ, right? And so that contributes to disunity within the body. And instead of promoting harmony and acceptance, it, in my opinion, fosters suspicion, it fosters resentment, and even division because you don't feel included again. So you are isolated. And so if I'm to be a part of your staff, if I'm going to be a part of your congregation, I should see my culture represented. I should hear music that is reflective of all. We have annual days or celebratory days, where we recognize the contributions of individuals. So if you're in your congregation are going to celebrate Columbus Day,
Mhm.
you are isolating a great population of individuals, regardless of ethnicity, who don't find Columbus Day to be worthy of celebration. Because how can you celebrate someone who gets credit for discovering someone else's house? Right, I was already living here, so how do you discover where I live and then get
Exactly.
credit for that? And so if we celebrate that, but we don't celebrate Juneteenth, or
Right.
we celebrate MLK Day, or we have no mention of Hispanic Heritage Month or Native American Heritage Month, or we do nothing for Black History Month, then what we're saying is we want you here. We want your funds here,
Mhm.
like having your face on our website,
Right.
but you're not going to see any reflection of your culture in our worship experience. And
Right.
then I think the last thing to answer your question in long form is that racism really undermines the gospel message of love and justice and reconciliation, Micah 6 and 8, right? When churches fail to address it, in my opinion, and strive for equity, the risk is that you distort and disregard core Christian values. So in order to overcome that impact, it's crucial, in my opinion, that faith communities provide and prioritize education, dialogue, action, and spaces where we create intentional, inclusive, anti-racist environments. So it's not enough to like, I'm not racist, but are you anti-racist?
Right.
Are you speaking up and are speaking out? Like when George Floyd happened, here in our city, a group of pastors from various reformations got together and we released a statement calling what we saw what it was, calling it murder, and then calling for a space for reconciliation and conversations. And what that did was send us on a very hard but necessary journey to try to understand each other's space, understand each other's perspective, and to create some actionable items that we collectively agreed upon to move forward. And so that was an intense period of training. It was called the Lubbock Roundtable. And it was, ethnicities, Hispanic, African American, Black, white, et cetera, that came together to talk about what's the root of racism, what's the root of these political issues. So to answer your question, I think there is a problem and we have to address it, the same way that it emerged. We have to come along and start tackling it in the heart. And it's hard, those difficult conversations. And there are people who honestly left that group
Okay.
very early on, but there are those who stuck with it. And we did some really good work in the community, even through the pandemic, to unite and have celebratory worship experiences in and inclusive of the
Right.
various styles of worship and speakers.
Okay. Well, you kind of opened up another question to that would add to that what I would add to your second question. You were talking about the African American pastor that joined a large Caucasian ministry, and
Mhm.
you talked about it, they loved his style and elements. So that would go to my next question: how is racial bias revealed in church leadership? Do you think that in your experience or you're talking to those pastors that are in that arena, that is just about showing a face to get people that look like you to come, and is not inclusive within the power structure?
I think there's a desire. I think I I I I hesitate on speaking about people's motivations, but I can only speak about the manifestation, right? And so racial bias manifests in church leadership in ways that are multiple, often, in my opinion, contributing to inequity of those marginalized populations within the congregation, like lack of representation. So church leadership often fails to reflect the racial diversity of the congregation or the broader community. And that lack of representation also affects the decisions that are made, which can reinforce existing power structures that marginalize further um, people of color. So if I'm a part of your team, I'm a part of the team. I'm not just the person who gets up and leads your praise and worship. Do I have a say on what that looks like? Do I have some influence? Can we have conversations about that? Do I, if I'm a part of the preaching team or whatever, am I required to fit the model? And I do believe that the senior pastor has the responsibility to creating the guidance of what we're doing. But do I have an opportunity to voice my opinion?
Right.
Because if you want to further grow your ministry and have representation from different populations, I bring me wherever I go. And so you mentioned me being the chair of the Chamber of Commerce. And when I served in that role, when I was asked to share, I said with the CEO, you do know you're getting Cory Powell, right? Like,
Right.
I'm going to bring my Blackness
Mm-hmm.
with me wherever I go. And if I disagree, I will speak my mind. And it was one of the most growth, most one of the opportunities that provided me the most growth as a person, because he and I spent a lot of time together meeting weekly and we traveled together. And at one point, he and I were traveling in Alabama and we were driving down the road and I looked at him and I thought, a few years ago, this would not even seem possible for a Black person and a white person to ride together doing business, right? He's an older, gray-haired white man. And I'm, heavy-set, dark-skinned guy. But we had some real hard conversations, and I was able to learn some things from him, and he was able to learn some things from me. But you have to be willing to have those conversations and inclusive. And then when you invite me to the table,
Mhm.
I get to eat what you eat. I get to help select what's on the menu.
Right.
I think also that unconscious bias shows up in hiring, right? Racial bias can impact the hiring decisions of pastoral and lay leadership positions on those preferences for certain qualifications or experiences or background can result in qualified candidates of color being overlooked or totally disregarded. And I think also the treatment, right? Church leaders may unintentionally treat members of different racial backgrounds differently, which leads to feelings of exclusion and inequality amongst the congregation. And it can also include the differences in access of opportunity, support, and resources. So you may want me to go to this conference because that speaks to you, but I have an experience that is different. And so do I get to go to my conference? I'm a part of a interdenominational pastoral alliance here in town, and we are very intentional of making sure that when we have functions, it rotates through not just different churches, but different denominations.
Okay.
Because we're trying to be inclusive, and there are female pastors that are included into our fellowship, which is very interesting because very early on, we had a situation where one of the pastors said, "Well, they can always come, but they can't stand behind my pulpit.
Right. Right.
So then, are they really welcome?"
Right.
Right? And then I think we have to be willing to have those conversations about cultural differences. So leaders that fail to recognize and appreciate the nuances of different racial groups within the church can result in miscommunication, misunderstanding, and again, the alienation. So you can't say I'm welcome, but then push me into a little bubble, because our expressions are different. And I remember being at a very large, very church of a very, very well-known conservative white pastor
Mhm.
who invited a very, very renowned and known Black pastor. And so whenever that Black pastor would show up at this event, naturally there are a lot of Black people that show up also. And during one of the services, we are a celebratory people. Our worship experience includes that. And so a particular woman in the church, the worship experience started feeling and rejoiced and was verbal. And I remember a team of white people ushering her out,
Wow.
right? And
Wow.
I remember thinking, wow, like they literally like, and I mean, it was being recorded and all of that, but in our, that's just normal. We want you to rejoice.
Right.
But again, am I welcome here? And then I think the last thing I would say on this question is the church leadership has to um, acknowledge when instances of racial bias show up within the congregation or within the structure, and they can't be resistant to being held accountable because that can perpetuate that cultural discrimination and literally prevent the progress toward inclusion. And so, my opinion, the racial bias in church leadership has to be addressed by leaders who engage themselves in self reflection,
Mhm.
who educate themselves, who are willing to have dialogue on race and racism, but also they have to be willing to actively work to identify and challenge those biases within their leadership.
Mhm.
Um, and when people see you trying to address issues,
Right.
even if they're not resolved, the fact that you were willing to admit that there was an issue or, we didn't handle that quite well.
Right.
I think that goes volume. That speaks volumes.
Well, you were speaking a lot about the organization that you were, the ministerial alliance that you're a part of, and that kind of goes to my next question was about what role do you think the senior pastor plays in the equity conversation? So amongst those pastors that you work with, particularly the Caucasian pastors, do you see them actually doing the work? We're not talking about motives, we're talking about actually, do you see the activity that would be more equitable for their leadership, for their engagement with the community, with their church?
I think I've seen a couple things. I think there are some who are very much committed, and then there are some who are committed to the talk.
Yeah.
Those who are actually committed to it, like they admit, I don't know. I want to learn. I
Mm.
want like, and so we invited that whole squad to come out to Juneteenth. And so I'm the co-chair of our Juneteenth celebration here in Lubbock. And on a particular night, we had gospel, and we invited them to come and to be part of like the altar call.
Right.
And they came and just got to be there and experience it. And several of them came up to me afterwards and talked about, and this is awesome. And then as part of that effort, we created an opportunity to have. We held a joint like Palm Sunday service,
Mhm.
and it was an outdoor amphitheater, and we included intentionally churches and invited their praise and worship leaders or their singers to be a part of that experience, to lead songs. So it was this, it showed the community what
Right.
we say we were about. But I think the role of the pastor is to unite believers and foster that sense of community within the church. Um, and I think when that doesn't happen, it can unintentionally contribute to division
Mhm.
because of race and politics. And we just came out of a really contentious political season, and there was clear divide. There was clear divide, and the incident you referred to was speaking about someone, you should vote for this party, and I think you can only speak for yourself. You do not get to speak for everybody, and
Right.
you don't get to tell us how we should interpret and how we should respond. And there are literally pastors in our city who have said, if you don't vote a certain way, then you can't be Christian. But I think we cannot have the leadership that refuses to acknowledge and address race, politics, and gender. I think avoidance those discussions dismisses their importance, and again alienates members and can cause them to have that feeling of I'm not welcome here, which will cause them to go somewhere else. I think also pastors that do not possess a deep understanding of cultural, political, and social context, and how of diverse populations, I think they perpetuate further those divisions, and minimize the concerns as being real. So I cannot become who I am and forget who I've been. I can't forget where I've come from. And
Mhm.
so when it comes to race and politics and gender, I am a product of a large matriarchal family.
Right.
So for someone to suggest that someone is unqualified to lead because they're a woman, to me is like a slap in the face of my mother, her sisters,
Right.
uh, my grandmother, right? Who my grandmother who had to take the lead and run and keep our family united after the death of my grandfather, and still maintain to keep to this day, 39 acres of land in our family, and for us to realize our family owned this land when people still thought they owned them, right? And so to think that we have to vote one way, and I'll say this, um, marginalized populations are not monoliths, right? We don't have all of us don't share the same values, but if you're not aware of the cultural competencies that are necessary to lead, you can inadvertently lead your people down a road of further division. And
Mhm.
so pastors, like all individuals, harbor unconscious biases that influence our behavior, and our decision makers. And these biases can lead to us favoring certain groups or favoring certain ideals that perpetuate stereotypes within the church. And so, if we are the church of the future,
Mhm.
and unless we're willing to address issues, we're going to lose people, right? And after the pandemic, it was reported multiple times that a third of the people who previously worshipped in person will never return to the church.
Yeah.
So what are we doing to engage the groups that are on the periphery? So like I was raised in church. I'm sure there are people like yourself. You're raised in the church, and that's what we know. But
Mhm.
our generation that's coming behind us and those behind them, They have a different view. And so they want to see modeled what we say we are about. So if pastors do not actively strive to create inclusive environments that values diversity and respects differences, members will feel that their identities are not welcome and they're not appreciated. And either they will not come or they will find spaces where they feel that they are.
Yeah. You actually sparked two things in me that additional kind of questions. I had never really thought about diversity of the worship experience as as a diverse kind of thing, if you understand what I'm saying. I never thought about worship expression as being a diversity,
Mhm.
but clearly it is. But it had never rang in my mind as a an element that needs to be kind of discussed because we do have different expressions that should be respected in all environments that we call ourselves welcomed into to worship.
Mhm.
So if I'm vocal, I shouldn't be frowned upon if you are quiet, and if you're,
Right,
it should be frowned upon that you're vocal.
right. And because we are the sum total of our experiences and our exposures, we often assume that our expressions, our styles are inclusive of everybody's. And it's okay to be uncomfortable,
Right.
right? Because there is a moment in time where I need some silence and I need to hear God speak to me. And there's some times where my heart is overwhelmed and I cry out unto the Lord. And so I encourage my congregation, like you can't judge my worship experience because you don't know my story. You don't
Right.
know what I've gone through. And the person sitting next to you may have been in an abusive situation all week, whether verbally, emotionally, or physically. And coming to church is a space where they feel safe.
Right.
And so no one should be making them feel uncomfortable. Years and years ago, I read the Purpose Driven Church by Rick Warren, and he talked about some things that we do traditionally in church that make people feel uncomfortable, not being mindful of the fact that not everyone comes with the same spiritual knowledge, the same worship style. So, for instance, asking visitors to stand up and identify themselves can be seen as isolated, even though we're trying to say, "Oh, we welcome you here." Maybe
Right.
I don't want to stand up right now, right? Can I just come and be here? And there are people, and I know, your worship style, the experience. I think the pastors have a hard job. I
Mhm.
think church leaders have a hard job in that we have to try to reach everybody. So you can have multiple generations in one worship experience. And you're gonna isolate somebody.
Yeah.
You're gonna isolate somebody. If it's contemporary, traditional folk ain't trying to hear you. If it's too traditional, the contemporary folk want to hear something. And so what we're seeing is churches are having different because most churches that have multiple service, each service has its own flavor.
Right.
So, a very good friend of mine is a pastor of a mega church in Houston, and his church, and his words are is intentionally intergenerational.
Yeah.
And at one point, he was having 5 services every Sunday, 7 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and then an evening service sometimes, right? And every one of his services had a different flavor. He would preach the same service, same sermon, each one, but he recognized that his 1 o'clock crowd was largely the college students or the folk who had been out the night before. And right,
Right.
earliest service was those early risers, which were largely seniors.
Yeah.
Okay. And so he would uniquely, and his music staff would uniquely integrate styles intentionally that was reflective. Now they've gone back to they've built a new building and they've gone to 2 services. He still has a youth sanctuary. They do their thing. But in every service, there's something for everybody. And so kind of like a comedian, you got to be diverse in the way you approach it. And the worship style and expression has to be included and appreciated because if I'm welcome, I'm welcome. If you tell me I can come to your house, but I can only stand in this place and I can only sit in this place and
Mm,
don't do this and don't do this and don't. At some point, I'm just gonna go home somewhere else.
right. Well, I'm running out of time, so
Sorry.
no. I should have purchased a bigger package. But my last question would be, do you think that racial reconciliation is possible or even desired within the climate that we've discussed, with the divisiveness with our political atmosphere, and with your experience with the churches that you deal with and within the community that you deal with?
I'll be very quick. Racial reconciliation, in my opinion, is both possible and desired amongst Christians. Now, whether that is realized is up to us. I think the values at this core of love, unity, and justice are certainly congruent with the words and teaching of the Lord. Um, I think unity in Christ is exemplified in Galatians 3:28. I think, fulfilling of the Great Commission, as in Matthew 28, is this is totally in alignment with this. And then modeling the love of Christ, which, in Mark 12, he says, we should love the great commandment of loving God and our neighbors as ourselves. And so it's possible. Is it probable should really be the question, I think. Because as long as we are comfortable being comfortable, we will never challenge ourselves and step out of those comfort zones. I think, to your point earlier, a lot of Black Christians feel very comfortable worshiping in white spaces, but are they led? Would a white congregation be appreciative of if the leader was not their ethnicity? Here in Lubbock, we did a thing where intentionally we rotated through churches.
Mhm.
I would go preach at this church would come preach, the pastor would preach at my church, like we did this thing. And there were a couple of pastors who said, I would love to do this, but my congregation just is not ready for it.
Wow.
It's like, and again, if you are the founder of the church and you have a different opportunity of freedom than if you are hired by the church.
Right.
So if you got elders and deacons who, you do too much, you're going to be gone.
Right.
So it is possible. I think it's desirable, but is it probable? And I think that really depends on us as believers. Are we willing to do the work? Because, like everything else, unity requires effort.
Yeah. Well, Pastor Powell, I really do appreciate your time. I know how valuable that is. And as we conclude this video, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, and thank you for so much that you have done to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout the community, throughout the church, and throughout the college atmosphere.
I appreciate you for the opportunity. And I would just like to say, this idea that diversity, equity, inclusion is anything but of God. Obviously, they have not looked at nature.
Yeah,
Because if you look at the bees, the birds, the lions, the tigers, all of the different animals, it's proof to me that God loves diversity from flowers to people. And if we are to be reflective of Him, we must likewise embrace differences, including in our worship and leadership roles in churches.
yeah. Thank you, sir. I appreciate you so much.
Likewise, my friend.
All right.